Good afternoon. In the light of some recent reports about the 15th Finance Commission, I have with me our IDFC Institute senior fellows Vivek, Dehejia and Praveen Chakravarty to discuss both some of the implications of the 15th Finance Commission reports that have appeared in the press, but also some of their recent work on economic divergence. Maybe that's a good place to start. If you could, if the two of you could just explain what did your work really find on economic divergence, what's the background to it, etc., and then we can take it from there.
Right. So thanks, Reuben. So just, to put it as succinctly as I can, basically our research looks at interstate income convergence / divergence, and contrary to much previous work that's come before us, we get very sharp results that post 1991, post the year of reforms, there's been a very sharp and a marked divergence in income per capita and a range of social indicators among the major states in India. And this puts us in marked contrast not only to what happened pre-91, but also to other large federal economic zones like the US, Canada, the EU, and even China. So this is striking to us. It has a range of implications that we then explore in the course of a series of papers, academic papers, policy briefs, op-eds, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, the one kind of caption, if I were, that we use for our research is what we call the 333 phenomenon, which is the three richest large states of India are 3 times richer than the 3 poorest large states on a per capita basis today. Mm-hmm. But this gap was only 2 times, less than 2 times in 1965. Mm-hmm. So the gap between the richer states and the poorer states are diverging. There will always be a gap, but we are pointing to the trends in this gap, which is not converging, but it's actually diverging. And hence, this can have a lot of ramifications, is our point.
And also just to add to it very quickly, the 333 phenomenon is unique to India. It's not this extreme in any other federal economic zone of which we are aware. So India, as we've just said, the trends are diverging, and the levels are also higher than you would find in most other places, including China, which has also had rapid growth and divergence in some sense, but not as sharp as ours.
But is there a time issue involved here? As in, China had a 10 to 13 year head start on reforms in India. So the question is, if we go back, say 15 years in China, do you see a similar divergence followed by convergence? I mean, what does the data on China actually say?
Yeah, so it's precisely for that, Reuben, we used a long enough data set from 1965 to 2015. So we kind of compensate for when reform started, policy measures started. And you're actually right, we do observe that in the data, which is China did experience a bit of divergence and then started to converge. Yeah. Now, we get this asked a lot. So what are the causal kind of relationships? Right. Is this the reforms? I've had various economists, including the chief economic advisor, tell me initial conditions do matter. So perhaps there was something called the endowment effect. To be honest, we don't know. We haven't looked into the causal factors.
Sure.
But I think to your specific question about China, the data is very clear. Even though there was divergence for a very short period, and it started to show rapid convergence very soon after their reforms process.
Okay.
Absolutely. Now, I suppose the one caveat is there are some people who are, folks who are skeptical of Chinese data. We can't do anything about that. We go with the official data.
Yeah,
but
you have to go with what you have.
Correct. Right. But the data makes it clear that there was indeed a little divergence, and then followed by convergence again fairly quickly. And so India again, is it possible that in 15 years from now then we may see convergence? Could happen. But we certainly don't see any sign of that so far in our data, Reuben.
Okay, so that provides me the perfect segue to jump into the story about the 15th Finance Commission. So apparently the terms of reference in the 15th Finance Commission public notice that appeared in the newspaper say that the Commission shall use the population data of 2011 while making its recommendations. Now, if you look at the weights, you'll see that the demographic weights have basically gone up from 10% to 27.5%. So embedded in this is a very, very tough question, which is on the one hand, for instance, if you say you're a proportional democracy, then by definition you should be allocating seats by virtue of proportion of population. But at the same time, one of the reasons why you see these huge gaps emerging now between the states is because some states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and specifically the southern states have actually performed really well on that front. They've actually, because of better healthcare, etc., etc. So how does one solve for that fundamentally tricky issue? And how? I mean, there's a question of fairness embedded on both sides of the equation,
exactly.
right? I mean, so on the one hand, you want to be fair to states with large populations, and at the same time, you want to be fair to states that have performed really well.
Yeah, the demographics does make it starker, right? I mean, and I'll give you this example. The median age, the average Bihari today is 19 years old.
Right.
The average person in Kerala is about 30 years old.
Right.
It's a generation apart.
Of course.
This gap is actually the largest of all federal economies in the world. But guess what? In 1965, the median age in Bihar was 19. The median age in Kerala was 21. So clearly, economic disparity is also connected, and the demographic disparity is connected. All of these are interconnected, right? Economic disparity, demographic disparity. So when you start looking at population figures, now, do you want to penalize Kerala for taking its median age from 21, 22 to 30? Because it's a direct function of how well you've governed the state, right? So you can't. But at the same time, you have to recognize that there is a large population that still needs basic state assistance in Bihar.
Now, if I could just jump in and add to that, Praveen. I mean, you've got something as stark. Imagine if in one political union, Reuben, you had regions or zones with levels of development as varying, say, Southern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, that's the problem we're looking at. I mean, India has economic units within it that that have levels of development, well-being, and so on that are widely divergent.
No, you're talking about human development
and GDP per capita. They all run together. So it really is a stark problem now. As it happens in the global political economy, Southern Europe is not governed in the same way as Sub-Saharan Africa. But in India, perhaps unique among major democratic federal economic zones, constitutional republics, with a sophisticated separation of powers and so on. We have to figure out how does a Kerala thrive in this union, or a Tamil Nadu, or a Maharashtra, and a Bihar, and a UP. It's a very difficult problem. As you say, there are fairness issues on both sides. There's no facile, easy answer to it.
Right. So given the transfers involved, and potentially at a later date, you could also see political power transferring as well. What's the incentive for well-performing states to stay within the union?
See, I'll tell you why I'm more optimistic about the union. Because of our political diversity, because of the regional political parties. It's the regional political parties that are that exclusively cater to residents in their state, but are important and play an important role in the center, will stand up and fight for these states, as is happening in Tamil Nadu, in Andhra Pradesh, in Telangana. So the regional parties, I think, will ensure that we sort this out amicably.
Assuming the regional parties do not get overwhelmed by a single national party, that's the assumption that you're making.
Which seems unlikely to happen, though.
That's certainly an assumption I'm making, and that's also I would have an empirical assertion that it is unlikely to continue. Right? So the regional parties will stay, and they're likely to continue. So that will provide the balance. Now the question really is, that still doesn't mean we must still solve this problem. We must have a formula. We must have some sort of empirical methods for devolution,
which is seen as fair by both
sides.
Absolutely. So let's go to the Finance Commission. So the 13th Finance Commission used 1971 data. You've got the 14th Finance Commission that used 10%. Now you've got 27.5%. So first of all, I will admit that I do not know what the basis for this recalibration is, and I'm guessing neither does anyone. But is a sort of phased thing like this the right approach?
No, right? Because I gave you the numbers of where we were in 1965 and where we are today.
Right.
So it's only fair that you take both into account when you come up with any formula
Right.
to devolve. So it's completely unfair to say we're now just going to discard and forget the past, and we're just going to take today as the starting point.
Right.
I can't vouch for whether the Finance Commission indeed plans to do this, but we're just going by what's in that story.
Yeah.
But I certainly don't think that should be the way. There should be a weight given for what we call the initial conditions, the 1971 census, and perhaps the 2011 census.
Okay.
So I think we can solve it formulaically.
And I think, correct. And I think when all is said and done, I think it's implausible to think that they will strictly go by the later population, by the most recent census, just because it makes the division so stark. And as this piece points out, the share of central revenues going to Kerala and a few other richer, smaller states would fall so dramatically that it would really, to go back to your earlier question, would threaten the bonds of the union. There's one other, let's not forget that India has not been unique in having this problem of diverse states. I mean, the U.S. in its earlier history had this problem. And the U.S. fought a civil war over a range of issues, including economic policy. Don't forget, it was the southern states that did not want the tariff to protect the industrial north.
That's right.
A civil war was fought, and the dust settled, and then the union was strengthened. So, there are lots of ways this can play out, and certainly when you hear secessionist noises coming up occasionally in the discourse, I do take them seriously. I don't take it that lightly. I think we need to be aware that the fiscal pressures of the union is going to be one factor that will pull us together or tear us apart.
So this is probably a good time to ask you guys your opinion on GST. Now, obviously, I think from a pure market perspective, it's a good reform. But in light of everything that we are discussing, I mean, you could, of course, make the argument that GST actually exacerbates some of these problems by taking the powers of taxation away from the states.
Which is what we've argued.
That indeed is the title of our EPW paper, which is GST exacerbates some of this problem, simply because, and I give this example often, which is, imagine this GST council, right? Representatives from all states.
Right.
Now they have to decide whether mobile phones should be taxed as a luxury good or as a necessity.
Sure. Or indeed whether chicken should be a luxury or
it's a luxury perhaps in Bihar, it's a necessity perhaps in Kerala.
That's right.
Right? How do you sit across the table and make this? And guess what? Both Bihar and Kerala have one vote each.
Yeah.
Even though 4 or 5 states contribute half of all tax revenues.
Sure.
Right? So there is, I think, a certain complication that arises with the GST. I think we've been fortunate at the time that we've introduced GST only because there has been reasonable political uniformity across India, with one national party, with the party in power at the center, as well as ruling or governing some of the major states. So we've kind of been lucky. The real test for GST is when that breaks.
Right.
When either one or the other or both of the big national parties don't control enough of the states to make it function smoothly at the level of the GST Council, which in a sense is one of the institutions that perhaps embodies constitutional, federalism or fiscal federalism or competitive cooperative federalism, whatever term you want to use. But how well will it, and that's the crux, how well will it function when you have strong regional parties, I mean, to take your hypothesis, Praveen, running the show in a bunch of different important states, will there be that cohesion in the council? And I think there's some question marks over that.
And that's a true test. Yeah.
Right. So this sort of begs the question of, have we, over the last 70 years, have we over-centralized? So for instance, to put this in context, the Constitution of India never mentions the word center. And yet, everything that we read in the newspapers, everything in the discourse is about center, state, etc., etc. And there's it may seem like a small semantic difference between a union of states and the sort of language we use today. But to me, it's a stark difference that the founding fathers actually understood the difference between a union of states versus what is being portrayed today. So that itself tells me that there has been an over-centralization. So is it time to sort of pedal back from that level of centralization?
Yeah, see, I mean, Reuben, Indian history does have examples of this. I mean, there was the famous Sarkaria Commission in the 70s that, came out with the report on center-state relations. There have been other such reports in the past. All of these, I go back to this point, these commissions were constituted and forced to look at this issue because we had regional parties. It was the DMK in Tamil Nadu that asked for these things.
That's right.
Right? So I think, to answer your question, did we over-centralize? I think we are over-centralized for the diverse union that we are, if I can use that word. And we must recognize that. And that's exactly what our work, we try and argue in our work. Let's recognize that there is this new idea of India, which is fairly diverse.
Can I just add to one little nuance to this, that if you look at our post-independence history, the argument we make, in fact, in the policy brief that we wrote, is that, look, in 1947, 1950, in that first phase after independence, when we had to stitch together the remnants of British ruled areas, princely states, there was a need to pull the union together, and we acknowledge that. Having said that, now 70 years later, we do have to pull back, recognize that we are a diverse union, union of very diverse states, and at some point, over-centralizing will cause pushback, blowback, that actually will unravel the bonds of the union. That's our view.
Right. So that's a fair argument, because I mean, if you go back to what Churchill said about India, India is no more a country than the equator is a country. Yeah. So in that sense, it probably did require that level of centralization. So what you're basically then sort of saying is some of the impulses in the Indian political arena today. So for instance, the imposition of languages or the imposition of food habits, and or what you can call imposition. I mean, maybe there are others who don't see it as imposition. Some of these actually contribute to making the problem a little bit worse, and actually doesn't leave the space.
Indeed. I mean, we've been talking economics and fiscal policy, but something as basic as not foisting or forcing Hindi on states, and for whom Hindi is not a native language or not a cognate language.
Right.
Something as basic as that really rankles and gets people's back up unnecessarily. And it's pretty simple not to do that.
Yes.
We're not even talking about fiscal federalism. It's a pretty basic idea. Let people speak their language. Let elections happen when they happen according to a state's timetable. Let's not force it on the center's timetable. Pretty basic things. Culture, food habits you talked about.
So the social, cultural bit matters almost as much as the political.
See, I mean, one nation, one election, one nation, one tax, one nation,
curriculum.
one curriculum, one nation, one entrance examination, one nation, one language. I'm not saying these are being implemented or forced upon, but why even add these to the
mix?
I mean, what purpose does it serve?
So I'm struck by something you said, Praveen. You used the term "new idea of India." So let's project 15 years from now, or say 20 years from now. What does this new idea of India look like? Are we talking United States of India? Are we talking something that looks more like the European Union? What are we talking about?
Yeah, see, I think, more like the European Union, but I think it's first important to understand that nobody is calling for a secession, right? The rich states understand very well.
European Union with political union.
With political union and currency union.
So US could be
the US.
one type of a model for that.
But it's important to understand that no rich state is standing up and saying, no, you cannot redistribute. Right? I mean, we all understand and accept that redistribution is required.
Yes.
We are debating the levels of redistribution and, like you said, fairness to all. Right? So 15 years from now, I do think regional parties will be stronger. That will hold India more as a United States of India, as you call it, and we will have much more powers devolved. I would, if I were to be a little bit controversial here, I may even question the longevity of the GST Council in its current form.
Interesting. So let me also throw out one other possibility. So you talk about regional powers. The other possibility is the national parties with a very strong regional leadership base, right? Rather than have very strong national leaders, actually have very strong state level leaders. Is that a possibility as well?
Absolutely.
It could be, now again, in my view, that would be a different kind of a model. And then there's always the question of, do state level leaders, I mean, the history in India has not been very good of state level leaders having the space to develop alternative models and policy methods, policy templates, as compared to the central leadership. Again, quite different from other federal states. In Canada, for example, the federal liberals do not dictate to to Ontario, Quebec, etc.
That's right.
They're party provinces. Parties function on their own. They have their own policy, templates. So I think perhaps one model could be a rise of regional parties, and the two big national parties loosening their grip on the state units.
Right, but it seems like one way to counter centrifugal forces is to actually federate further.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That is our basic argument.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And because we're in the policy world, I would always kind of smirk when we would go and say, let's say we're advocating labor reforms, we would go to the center and say, but you govern in 18 states. Why didn't you just get them to do it?
Right.
It runs exactly counter to how we think
right.
the country should run.
Right. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Great discussion as always.
Thank you.
Thanks, Reuben.